Good evening, everybody, or should I perhaps say good morning or good afternoon, depending on which part of the globe you're tuning in from to follow us. My name is Vuk Jeremic, and it gives me an immense pleasure to wish you a virtual welcome to Belgrade, the home of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, Southeast Europe's leading foreign policy think tank. Our goal, our mission, is to try and help public in the region and beyond make a better sense of what is going on in the world which is arguably being shaken like never before in living memory. Half of the planet's population is in lockdown, bringing the global economy to a virtual halt. For the first time in history, the price of oil in America is negative. Several leaders around the world have declared that we are at war, this time with an invisible enemy, COVID-19. Now, what is going on in the world? And perhaps more importantly, what will happen after the fog of war subsides and there is a new dawn on humanity? Whose fault was this? Was it anyone's fault? What are going to be the repercussions of this crisis on the most consequential relationship of our times, that between the United States and China? And what are going to be the repercussions on the world from the trajectory of this relationship? Well, answers to this and many other questions are going to be given to us today by two exceptional speakers, real sages, diplomatic grandees. The first one of them is my friend Ivo Daalder, a great American scholar and senior diplomat. He was educated at the universities of Kent, Georgetown, and Oxford before receiving his PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was a senior fellow at the Harvard University and also at the Brookings Institution in Washington. He was also teaching at the University of Maryland. He was a White House director for Europe at some point in his career, and he was also an advisor to the victorious campaign of President Barack Obama. He served as the American ambassador to the North Atlantic Council and is currently the president of one of U.S. most influential think tanks, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's a prolific author of many books, the last one being The Empty Throne, America's Abdication of Global Leadership. My second interlocutor today is Kishore Mahbubani. He's a legend of multilateral diplomacy and one of the great sages of Asia. He was an advisor to Lee Kuan Yew, and after spending decades building one of the most competent diplomatic services in the world, received the Gold Public Administration Medal of the Republic of Singapore. He was the founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and The Prospect magazine place him on the list of the top global thinkers of today, together with the likes of Pope Francis, Elon Musk, and Amartya Sen. He's an author of many books on Asia and the world. The Great Convergence was translated into dozens of languages, including Serbian, and it gives me a great pleasure to say that it was the CIRSD who was the publisher of Kishore's great book, now a diplomacy textbook in Serbia. His latest book is titled, in a very provocative way, Has China Won? It happens to be also the cover page of the last issue of The Economist. So this book was written before the COVID COVID-19 crisis. Now, thank you guys for joining. It's a great pleasure to have you. And allow me to ask the first question to Kishore without revealing the content of his book. So we're not going to reveal the content of the book. We're not going to say whether China has won or hasn't won, according to Kishore. But the COVID-19 happened. Now, what is your opinion, Kishore? After COVID-19, is China likelier to win or not in comparison to before? And what does winning mean to begin with?
Mm. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's such a pleasure to be with you, Vuk, and with Ivo, with whom I just did another program a few weeks ago. I think the correct term you use, Vuk, is that we are still surrounded by the fog of war. I think COVID-19 is proving to be far more dangerous and far more difficult to handle than I think anybody anticipated. So, for example, even Singapore, which should be relatively well prepared for something like this, is really struggling still with COVID-19. And I think it will be premature for any country to declare any kind of victory against this virus because it's very, very unlike the other viruses. But nonetheless, if you ask as of now, which countries are doing well, it's countries like China, South Korea, to some extent Singapore, if you leave aside the foreign worker problem, or you take societies like Hong Kong and Taiwan have done well too. So it's clear that there's a certain degree of competence in government institutions that has been developed in East Asia, including China, and that competence is showing itself and manifesting itself in the way it's handling this crisis. And in the case of China, I think it reflects a very, very deep investment on the part of the state to recruit the best and brightest of the society to work in the government organs. So you see the quality of mind of people who are, let's say, deployed in the health services or other important state agencies has never been higher in China. So that I think show what this crisis has shown is some of the deeper strengths that China has developed, and it shows that perhaps it would be a mistake to underestimate what China can do. It'd be safer to overestimate what China can do in the coming decades.
Well, thank you, Kishore. And what's your take, Ivo, on the title of Kishore's book, or perhaps on the front page of The Economist, saying, "Is China winning?" Is China winning these days, and how does it look from an American lens?
Well, first of all, Luke, thanks so much for inviting me. And Kishore, it's great to be with you again. It seems like, on the one hand, we can't meet in person, even our neighbors across the street, but we seem to be able to meet very frequently online. So the one benefit, I guess, of this crisis. So it's great to see you again, Kishore, as well. I agree with Kishore's big point. Which is that there is one thing that has been consistent in this crisis, which is that we have underestimated its severity. And I think when I say we, I think that it's truly everyone, with very, very, very few exceptions. Perhaps Taiwan and Singapore, because they lived through the SARS crisis, were able to act a little sooner, and as a result, were able to prevent the very worst from happening. Other countries have learned from the mistakes that others have made. So I'm thinking here of New Zealand and Australia that took very early action and were able, in the case of New Zealand, perhaps being the first country to eradicate the disease from the two islands. But overall, I think the Chinese underestimated it in December and early January. and everyone else continues to underestimate, I think, the long-term damage that COVID-19 is doing to the global order in two fundamental ways. One, this disease is going to be with us for a lot longer than people seem to think. This whole idea that we are reopening the economies, that things will soon go back to normal, whether that's true in China or anywhere else, we're finding that once you reopen, the disease just comes back. It's happening in China, it's happening in Singapore. It will no doubt happen in Europe and the United States when things change there. Secondly, we haven't even seen the worst of it. We may have seen some peaking in certain parts of the world, but much of the world is at the beginning of this crisis. In Africa, throughout Latin America and South Asia, we will see a lot going that will be worse. And as a result, thirdly, the economic rebound is just going to take a lot of time. This is not a V-shaped depression. It is a W or multi-W depression. All of which then asks the question, what is the impact of this on the global order? And the only answer I can give to that, it is way too early to come to the conclusion of who is winning, who will have won, and equally importantly, who has lost. What I can say today is that China is still in a position over time to come out of this on top. The United States is still in a position, together with its allies, to come out on top. And the question is, how are both countries leading internationally in order to find out where we're moving? We haven't decided this yet. I think Kishore's book, quite rightly, still has a question mark in the title. And as a result, I think we will take some time to decide how are both countries managing this crisis, how are they seen to be managing the crisis, and as a result, to see who comes out with the best advantage.
As a very quick follow-up to that, Ivo, this is probably the third big crisis of this century. The first one being the 9/11, and the second one being the 2008 great financial crisis. But unlike in the first two, where America was clearly center and front in addressing the consequences, and some would agree and some would disagree with whether this was the best way around it, but America was undoubtedly in the driving seat. And today it doesn't seem so. Why? First of all, am I right in saying this? And why is this the case?
Yeah, you're clearly right, and I would argue that this is the worst crisis since World War II. It is incomparably greater than 9/11 and the financial crisis, or indeed any other crisis we have seen since World War II. And the defining aspect of World War II is twofold. One, the absence of the United States at the start of that war. It was nowhere to be found. It was not part of the conflict. It did not declare war on Germany in 1939, as France and Britain did. Indeed, it was not part of the war until it was attacked by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. So the absence of the United States led to a worldwide conflagration that led to a war that even today stands as unique in world history. The second aspect of World War II was the presence of the United States, the leadership of the United States, that once it did engage, it engaged fully, completely, and totally in terms of its economic potential to create what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, and of course by winning fundamentally the war, first in Europe and then in the Pacific. And coming out of that war as the unquestioned global leader that then created an international order that for much of the 20th century extended only to the Western world, but the Western world was pretty large, in which the United States created security institutions, open economic systems, and promoted democracy, freedom, and human rights, and did so as a self-declared but well-accepted leader of the free world. And that has been the dominant trend of American foreign policy and global engagement for the last 70 years. It's absent, as you note, today, in a way that is remarkable by its absence. We do not see the United States leading international institutions, whether it's Western institutions like the G7, global institutions like the United Nations and the G20, or any other institutions. Indeed, we see the United States focused solely and completely on securing supply and capabilities to ensure its own citizens and its own people are protected without regard of the rest of the world. And this America First policy, as President Trump enunciated during the campaign and has pursued ever since, is a direct stands in direct contrast to 70 years of American leadership. And indeed, that the book that I wrote with Jim Lindsay, The Empty Throne, is about that abdication of global leadership and its consequences. And I think we're seeing it today.
Well, thank you, Ivo. Sure, I'm going to get back to you now. There's a lot of discussion these days in global media, in the halls of power, in the street, with this absence of American leadership. China's presence seems far more visible, if you will, than it was before. And there's this number of conflicting views as to what China wants. And when I say what China wants, let me try to focus it a little bit more. How would you describe, in simple terms, what is it that China's leadership wants before as well as now in the midst of this crisis? What are the strategic goals of the Chinese government, in your view?
Well, let me begin first of all by saying I completely agree with what Ivo just said about the very important leadership role that the United States has played in the world over 70 years. And most important thing that the United States gifted to the world was the 1945 rules-based order, and that rules-based order basically facilitated the rise of East Asia and also the rise of China. So, and I agree with Ivo, it's a pity that we don't see this leadership today. Now, the question therefore arises, can China step in and play their role? And what are China's goals? And I think it's important to understand that to understand China's goals, you must understand China's history. And from the Chinese, when the Americans took on the leadership role at the end of the World War II, they were doing so in the middle of the American century, when everything had gone right in America for almost 100 years, you know. And so America was becoming stronger and stronger and stronger with decade after decade. China, by contrast, what is etched in the Chinese minds is the 100 years of humiliation that they suffered from 1842 to 1949, the Opium War, the seizure of Chinese territories, the sacking of the Summer Palace, the reparations that the Chinese had to pay. So the Chinese discovered that when they were weak, the whole world, especially the West, trampled on China, and the Chinese people suffered a lot. So if you want to answer your question about what are China's strategic goals, it can be captured in two words, which is never again. Never again will China allow itself to be weak and trampled by the rest of the world. So the primary goal is to make China as strong as possible. But of course, the Chinese have also in the process asked themselves, why did they become so weak? How could the world trample on them? And one answer they came to was that the reason why they became so weak is because they cut themselves off from the world. They isolated themselves and they didn't understand the world had changed. So today, the second strategic goal of the Chinese is we must remain globally engaged. So at a time when the United States, let's say, is retreating from free trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China is still advancing towards free trade agreements because China understands that global engagement is very important. So from the Chinese point of view, they actually want to maintain this 1945 rules-based order because that has facilitated their rise. But the next question is, can they then provide the leadership to manage these institutions? And that's where, for the Chinese, is actually very difficult. The Chinese, unlike the United States of America has a kind of universalizing mission that believes that the whole world can become like and become American like America. The Chinese believe that only the Chinese can become Chinese. They don't believe that anybody else can become Chinese. So they want to see a strong China. They want to cooperate with the rest of the world, but I think they're not yet ready to provide the kind of leadership in the way that the Americans did in the past. So I believe that the Chinese are ready to cooperate with the rest of the world. They are prepared to work with, for example, in G20 and in the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, China played a very critical role in trying to save the world from a financial crisis that was created, actually, as you know, by the Lehman Brothers crisis. The Chinese say it doesn't matter who created it. What matters is that the whole world is suffering. We must come together and solve it. So I would say what we need to do, therefore, is to use the current institutions, including, by the way, the World Health Organization, and strengthen these organizations and work with China in these organizations.
Eva, would you agree with that? How would you define what are the goals of China viewed from an American perspective?
I think we are still seeing the evolution. I think Kishore gives a view that I think is perfectly plausible. Certainly on the first issue of never again assuming there is the humiliation, and secondly, to have a global engagement that is based on some concept of order. And I guess the real question is, what's that concept? And just maybe to highlight a potential difference that I think Kishore is also highlighting between how the United States opted to lead in the world and how China is looking at that issue. Remember that the U.S., although I've been thinking through World War II about how to organize the global order, really was pulled in a wonderful phrase. It was an empire by invitation. There were a lot of countries that were extraordinarily weak after World War II, who faced, particularly in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, with the possibility of a revolutionary Soviet Union, wanted to be protected and wanted to have a way to be part of an international system that was U.S. led. And the desire for U.S. leadership was very high in 45, and in many ways continues up to this very day. There is a hunkering for an America that is willing and able to lead in not just the universalizing mission that Kishore talks about, but in this fundamental way of bringing countries together, building and strengthening and maintaining institutions to deal with common problems. China doesn't have that capability, in part because a lot of people don't trust China. They're worried that the Chinese interest isn't in building a global system that provides for public goods that are available for everyone. They're worried that China is going to use the historical parallel of all other hegemonic powers, which is to maintain power by brute force or by the overwhelming economic and military power that it possesses. There's hardly anyone who is inviting China to take a leadership role other than the fact that the United States is not fulfilling it. And so this question of how these two powers are going to deal with the issue of how one leads is particularly important. I think the reason that China has a larger role to play today is because the United States no longer plays it. Nature abhors a vacuum. The Chinese are by far the most important power in the world aside from the United States, and they have stepped in. We are seeing some of the reaction to that. We're seeing that in Europe. We're seeing that in other places where the reaction is, well, one, not so fast, and two, it's not really clear that you have our interests at heart. And that's true on the Huawei and 5G questions. It's true on economic investment and trade questions. It's true on the BRI and the Belt and Road Initiative. there is a debate within every society, including yours, Fook, about the relative interest of China, and there's a huge debate here in the United States, where many are seeing China, are looking at China as a zero sum power rather than a positive sum power, in terms of who is getting the most ability to use engagement to its own benefit.
Well, very interesting. Kishore, Ivo mentioned Huawei, and this is one of the big topics in, for example, the tech world. Whether we are now witnessing the beginning of bifurcation, of the decoupling of technological ecosystems of China in the West. For the time being, it doesn't seem like the West is very comfortable with letting in Huawei. China is definitely not comfortable with letting in companies like Google or Amazon or Facebook into China. People are now starting to talk about separate clouds, separate AI development, and there's some people wondering if this trajectory is reversible. Are we going to see the continuation of technological decoupling leading to a decoupling of supply chains, leading to two separate, almost totally exclusive economic systems, and ultimately Cold War? Are we moving along this trajectory at this moment? What do you think?
Well, I think maybe my role is to cheer up everybody. And I don't see a dark future ahead for us, because I think it's also important, and by the way, I completely agree with Ivo that in 1945, the world was such a distraught place in many ways. A major world war, the rest of the world, including Singapore, India, was still all colonies. So it was a dark and depressing world in 1945, and America's willingness to help the world was like a shining light for the world at that time in 1945. But we are now 75 years later, and we are now in 2020. It's a very different world today. And you have countries that are much more self confident, aware of what they can do, and willing to make their own judgments of what is good for them. And as I say in the chapters of one of my book, Has China Won, that if you have 330 million people in America, 1.4 billion in China, you still have almost 6 billion people outside in the rest of the world. And these 6 billion people are going to choose very carefully. And I can confidently make a prediction that, let's say, if tomorrow the United States decided to say, okay, I'm going to have another Cold War, this time against China, and I'm going to start a containment policy, will you all please join in? I would say the number of countries who joined enthusiastically the first Cold War in 1949, you won't get the same kind of number of countries joining in 2020. Because at the end of the day, what all the countries in the world want is they want to work with the United States, with the strengths that the United States has, and they want to work with China with the strengths that China has. And the big message from virtually most of the countries that I speak to nowadays is, don't force us to choose. We will work with you on issues that we think you and I can cooperate and we'll both benefit. And we will work with China on issues where we can cooperate. And if you look at it in practical terms, over 100 countries today do far more trade with China than they do with the United States. And from many countries' point of view, in practical terms, if you are literally looking for good infrastructure, you're looking for a good road, a good fast train, a good port, and a good telecommunication system, you find that the package that China is offering to you at the end of the day is beneficial for you. And so you accept it, right? And that's why you can't. For example, if you take the Belt and Road Initiative, which I think you also mentioned, countries are free to join or not to join. So Japan doesn't join, which is understandable. India doesn't join, also understandable because of their problems with the China-Pakistan economic corridor. But the vast majority of countries are joining, including European countries like Italy, Greece, and so on and so forth. So it is a different world. So what I would say in this world, the best thing that the United States and China could do is not force countries to choose one or the other, but to work with the countries in the areas where they can work and cooperate together. And most countries in the world want to have good relations with the US and good relations with China.
Well, thanks, Kishore, for being this positive. But as you know, not everybody shares this view. For example, it was famously said in Munich. It was a few months ago at the Munich Security Conference. I know that Eva was attending it. There was a meeting between U.S. senators, led by Senator Lindsey Graham, and the chiefs of German companies, in which Lindsey Graham said quite literally, if you allow Huawei into your technological ecosystem, you are going to have us as enemy. That sounds like America is about to force upon a choice, at least on its closed allies. So, what's your take on this, Ivo?
So I agree and disagree with Kishore. I agree fundamentally that if the United States behaves in the way that you are describing as it behaved in Munich, we're going to lose the trade-off between what China has on offer and what the United States has on offer. But what the United States has on offer is a whole lot more than don't buy Huawei. What the United States can have on offer is still the capacity to corral large parts of the world towards common action to deal with the major problems of the day. And I do think that there are areas in which, of course, the United States needs to cooperate with China. I'm thinking about climate. Certainly, COVID-19 is one of those areas where the absence of cooperation hurts both of our countries and parts. But there are others in which we will need to compete. And the way we compete is not through military competition or a new Cold War in a sort of zero-sum way. The way we compete is the way we've always competed. That is to provide and lead a global order that emphasizes the importance of strong security ties to make sure that no one challenges the territorial, political integrity and political independence of countries. And that's one of the issues that is at stake in the South China Sea, where we build an open economic system, one in which we abide by the rules, and if there are violations of those rules, we go to the international institutions that exist to deal with them. In the trade case, the WTO, and if we don't like the way the WTO is being managed, we help reform it, not abandon it. That we do the same when it comes to the questions of human rights and democracy and freedom, and that we band together to make sure that countries they don't have to accept our political system. Our political choices are ones that we made at home, but that if you violate fundamental human rights, as the Chinese are clearly doing in parts of their own country, or are building an internet or a cyber infrastructure that bans whole parts of the internet, that there are going to be consequences. But the way to do that is by building coalitions, by building strong, capable coalitions in order to provide a counterbalance and an incentive for other countries, starting with the Chinese, to play by the rules. And if the rules need to be changed to accommodate a rising China, you do that through negotiations, as indeed we've done in the IMF and should have done in the IMF and World Bank. So I think there is a cooperative order, but that order has to be based on a confident leadership by the United States. But that leadership means you have followership. You have countries who come with you, and not divide the world into our sphere versus their sphere. And if you're with them, then you're not with us. This, you're either with us or with against us, may have worked after 9/11 when it comes to terrorism. It's not a particularly good way to deal with international policy.
Can I
Thanks,
just chip
Ivo.
in with one small point here?
Sure,
Can I just
absolutely.
chip in
Please
quick?
do.
Yeah, in my book, I talk about George Kennan and the advice he gave to America as it embarked on its major Cold War against the Soviet Union. And it's interesting, he gave 4 pieces of advice. He said, the most important thing is to maintain a spiritual vitality at home. It's the strength of your domestic order that ultimately is what's going to attract the rest of the world to you. Number 2, cultivate friends and allies. Number 3, don't insult countries. And you don't even insult the Soviet Union, because at the end of the day, we have to deal with them. Number 4, be humble. And what's interesting is that these pieces of advice that George Kennan gave in 1949 are still valid today. That this is the way you deal with a big adversary, and not try to do all the kinds of things that are going on today. Because I must say, the one thing that worries me is that there is now a freedom to insult China. You can say anything you want against China. It's a sort of license to insult. And I think that's wrong. I mean, you may disagree with China, you may disagree many things that they're doing, but at the end of the day, they're also still an old civilization. And the Chinese are very proud of their civilization. And the Chinese have now reached a point, and this is something that I wish somebody would try and explain to America. They're tired of these insults, very, very tired. And what my big fear is that the more you insult them, you get the result that George Kennan anticipated in his 1949 advice. You then deal with an irrational adversary rather than a rational one that you can deal with.
That's very interesting, and that actually leads me well to my next question. In your book, Has China Won? You have an imaginary memo written to President Xi Jinping by a member of Politburo advising the president what to do. But that was before COVID-19. It was before this escalation. Now, I'm going to ask you to imagine yourself being the national security advisor of Xi Jinping and having to write a one-page memo with up to 3 recommendations. 3 things that you, the national security advisor to President Xi Jinping, would recommend that Xi Jinping should do now. What would that be?
Well, as you know, the main point of the memo in my book to Xi Jinping was, whatever you do, don't underestimate the United States of America. It's a remarkable country. So that was the main point of that memo to Xi Jinping. And today, I would say the 3 priorities, if I was the national security advisor, Xi Jinping, the 3 priorities that China must do today, clearly, number 1, it's got to kill COVID-19. That's got to be the total national effort. And clearly, if the Chinese scientists can find the right vaccine or the right antidote to it, that would be amazing. That's what the world will want to do. See, the number 2, I would say, this crisis has given China a huge opportunity, because there are countries around the world that are struggling to find masks, personal protection equipment, ventilators. And as you know, at the end of World War II, America had this incredible industrial capacity. Incredible. Today, that same industrial capacity is what you find in China. And the Chinese can produce this stuff at a remarkable rate and they're exporting, I don't know, hundreds of millions of masks every day now. So that's what they should be doing. And the third thing, of course, this is a very critical point, that China should adopt the World Health Organization and once again make it a very strong and powerful organization because, as you know, in the book, The Great Convergence, I explained that the West made a big mistake in cutting down the mandatory contribution to the World Health Organization from 62% to 18%. So the WHO can only rely on 1/5 of its budget. 4/5 is voluntary, it keeps bouncing up and down. The mandatory portion of the budget must be pushed up so that the World Health Organization can recruit scientists, health inspectors, all the staff you need to deal with the next pandemic. So invest in it now, and China can say, okay, I will invest in the WHO and get the best doctors from all over the world to come and work in the WHO to make sure that next time this pandemic happens, we will have a stronger WHO rather than a weaker WHO.
That is fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to ask a very similar question to Ivo, but it's going to be more difficult because it is going to take a little bit more imagination. I know, Ivo, that you are not in the top 5 admirers, let me put it this way, of Donald Trump. But I know that you are a great American patriot. So imagine that you wake up tomorrow morning and somehow you realize that you woke up in Washington and that you are the national security advisor of Donald J. Trump. And you are asked exactly what I asked Kishore, to write a one-page memo with up to 3 recommendations to President Donald J. Trump. What would those recommendations be?
So you're right. That's not very likely to ever happen as a part of current political alignments. And so let me say that the memo I'd write is the same memo I'd write to any president. And they're not that different, although they're different tonally than I think Kishore's memo to Xi. Number one is I think finding a way to unite the nation behind the fight against COVID-19 is absolutely critical. And it's critical for 2 reasons. One, it's the only way to actually succeed. We will not succeed in the way that we have been dealing with this crisis in the past 3 or 4 months, which is to say that there are 50 states and God knows how many municipalities, and they can all figure it out. It needs a united effort directed from the center by the federal government, led by the President of the United States. And in order to do that, you need to make some tough decisions, and most importantly, take responsibility for the outcome. And so getting that process right so that you can then marshal the great, unlimited, and unheard of resources that the United States still possesses to deal with this crisis is extremely important. One, in order to deal with the disease, but 2, in order to send the message to the rest of the world that the United States remains a competent, capable country to deal with a crisis like this. And right now, that's not the message that's being sent. Number 2, it means going out and reminding oneself and one's friends and allies who are friends and allies, and to bring together the great friends and allies we have in North America, in Europe, and in Asia, in a constructive effort to rebuild a rules-based global international order that is fundamentally based on the 3 pillars of common security, open and free economics, and strong democracy and human rights and freedom. And to rebuild that friendship and alliances that we can with our friends in Asia, with our friends in Europe, with our friends in North America, and indeed in South America, and once again become this global leader that deals with global problems in an effective way. And then third, I think it is extraordinarily important that we rebuild the global institutions that truly matter for managing what's happening. Starting, I think, rightly, as Kishore said, the WHO, which needs more funding and indeed more independence to be able to act as a guardian of public health rather than as a instrument of the most powerful. And one reason I would be worried about China pushing to become the lead funder and enabler of the WHO is because I don't think that China always puts public health beyond first. Indeed, its decision to continue to bar Taiwan from the WHO's engagement is a one driven by politics and not by public health. It was, after all, the Taiwanese who were the first to warn the WHO of what was happening in Wuhan, and again has demonstrated an ability to deal with the disease that is enviable by any standards. But I would go beyond the WHO. I think we need to rebuild the WTO. I think we need to have a trading organization that is strong, capable, and has the enforcement mechanisms that, frankly, the U.S. Has undermined. I think we need to reform the United Nations. I think we need to have a system that is no longer the legacy of World War II, but is the predecessor of what a 21st century security architecture looks like. And this, in other ways, I think what we need is an America that is again interested, this is by bottom line, in leading rather than winning. There's a fundamental difference between the two. Winning you do by beating somebody else. Leading you do by getting others to come with you. And we have been leading for 75 years. And recently we have traded that for winning. Winning is zero sum. Leading is positive sum. And the way we're going to deal with this world is to understand that if you insist on winning, you're going to lose.
You, both of you, are obviously devout multilateralist, and so am I. So I just wish that I had you, Ivo, as American ambassador, and you, Kishore, as the Chinese ambassador to the UN at the time when I was president of the General Assembly. But maybe one day this kind of thinking is going to prevail. I'm very hopeful that this is going to be the case. This was my last.
I hope Kishore will remain
question.
the Singapore ambassador.
Yeah. I'm going to now go to the last portion of my questions before going to some of the questions given to us by our audience. It's a very simple, quick block. It's called the Blitz questions. You are allowed only to give a yes or a no answer. So it means that we don't take it depends. We don't take, I don't know, and it's hard to tell. You're essentially asked to make an educated guess or a bet about the following. It's the year 2025, and the 5G networks have been rolled out in the whole of the world. Now, we mentioned Huawei before, so it's a big issue. It's a controversial issue. So I'm going to ask you a question. Whether the following country in 2025 is going to have, in your opinion, Huawei built into their 5G systems? Yes or a no? And I'm going to start by Kishore asking him about India.
Yes.
Ivo, Pakistan.
Yes.
Kishore, South Korea.
Yes.
Ivo, Italy.
No.
Kishore, Japan.
No.
Ivo, Turkey.
Yes.
Kishore, Brazil.
No.
Ivo, Hungary.
Yes.
Kishore, the United Arab Emirates.
Yes.
Ivo, Mexico.
Yes.
Kishore, Singapore.
Yes.
Ivo, Singapore.
Yes.
Kishore, Serbia.
Yes.
Ivo, Serbia.
Yes.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. Kishore is slightly more bullish on Huawei, but it was a fascinating exchange. Thank you very much for that. Now, if you allow me, I'm going to ask you a few very interesting questions that came from our followers and members of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. Try to be as succinct as possible so that we can answer as many questions as possible. We have 10 more minutes for our conversation. The first question is for Kishore, and that's from Sinisha from Belgrade. He's asking you, is the Communist Party of China really popular in China? And if it is popular, what's the reason for their popularity?
Well, I think the problem in understanding the Chinese Communist Party is the name. It's called the Chinese Communist Party. And yet we know that China is no longer exporting communism. I think once you understand that the people of China see the CCP as the Chinese civilization, as the party that is once again strengthening China, making China a strong civilization, making China a respected country in the world. And the CCP has delivered in the last 40 years a far greater improvement in the standard of living of the Chinese people than the Chinese have enjoyed in the last 4,000 years. So, having experienced this dramatic improvement in the standard of living of the people, and seeing how respected China is internationally, that's why the CCP is popular still in China.
Thank you. Now, question for Ivo from Alexander from Banja Luka. Senator Cotton from Arkansas and Representative Crenshaw from Texas introduced a bill last week that would allow Americans to sue China in federal court in the United States for death, injury, and economic harm caused by the Wuhan virus. Is that going to become law, in your opinion? And if it does become a law, what would that practically mean?
I think it's very doubtful that something like this becomes law. There's no doubt that the virus originated from China, but it's not a Chinese virus. The virus doesn't have a passport. It doesn't. It crosses borders in human beings who can be human beings from any of the 7 point some billion people that we have, and that's why this is a global pandemic. There's no doubt that China made early mistakes in treating the disease. It underestimated the extent of the disease. It hid information about it for too long, and as a result, the disease was able to spread globally. But even if China had acted with all of the foresight and with all of the transparency, it is highly likely that this global disease would have spread globally. And every country does have a responsibility, first and foremost, to deal with this question and the threat that the public health threat that the virus causes. And the United States' failure to do so is not because of what the Chinese did; it's because what America did. And the success in countries like Taiwan and New Zealand is because of what the Taiwanese did and the New Zealanders did. So I don't see this as something that should be litigated in a court of law, nor do I think that reparations are the responsibility of a single country versus everyone else. This is why I don't like the war metaphor. The war metaphor assumes that there is a initiator of conflict, and in this case, the initiator of conflict is not a country; it's a virus.
Thank you, Ivo. Katerina from Novi Sad, the question for Kishore. Is China ever going to accept an international independent investigation into what really happened in Wuhan?
Well, I think a lot will depend in how this investigation is framed. So, is it perceived to be a hostile effort, on the basis of legislation, say, passed in the US Senate to try and embarrass China, of course, China will say no. But if you can assemble a group of independent scientists that are internationally respected, that China respects, and so on and so forth, and you put together a team of international scientists, I think the Chinese would welcome such an investigation because they themselves realize how dangerous and how formidable this virus is. I think what people don't seem to understand is that we were always very frightened of Ebola, we were frightened of SARS, but this is actually something far worse because it can actually infect people even though you yourself may have no symptoms at all. You may look perfectly fine, but there you are going around infecting a lot of people. So it's a much more dangerous and much more tricky virus to handle. So this is where really all the investments in science we made in all these years, we should be pooling the scientists and bringing them together to deal with this. And if that's what the effort is, I think China would welcome it.
Thank you, Kishore. That is really interesting. I got to ask you this question, and it's got to go to both because it was such a brilliant way to start a question. And I know it's a difficult one to answer, but Vladimir from Kruševac, it's a town in central Serbia. He says, to quote the Yogi Berra, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But if you were to place a bet today, regardless of your personal political sentiment, who do you think will be elected in November as President of the United States?
Ivo
Do you want
first.
me to go first? I think Joe Biden
I
will be
didn't want to
elected.
press.
I
I think
concede you
Joe
know more about
Biden will
America
be,
than I do.
And what do you
like I
think,
said,
Kishore?
I think Joe Biden will be president.
And you, Kishore?
I'd be Joe Biden.
Wow, that is very, very interesting. We're
By the way,
definitely going to meet
I
once
should mention
again.
I should mention when I was in Davos in January this year, everyone thought that Trump would be the next president. So
And
what
now,
a difference!
in only a few short months, everything went
For
upside down. And the last question for Kishore is from Angela from Niche. She's asking, if China wins, is it going to behave like America? For whatever it means.
I think I'm glad that Evo made a distinction between winning and leading. And I think that's a very critical distinction. And I actually conclude my book by saying that the real test about this question is not about whether China wins or whether America wins, but whether humanity wins as a result. Because right now, what we are facing are some remarkable global challenges. And I wrote this before COVID-19. I was thinking of global warming. I said if the US and China keep fighting while global warming is happening, future generations will see them as two tribes of apes fighting each other while the forest around them was burning. So at the end of the day, if we want to focus on winning, we should focus on how we ensure that humanity wins at the end of the day. And that's what we should strive to do with both US and China.
Thanks, Kishore. And the last question of this conversation goes to Ivo. It's from Ivana from Novi Sad. Ambassador Daalder, what is your message for the people of Serbia?
My message to people of Serbia is to remember that you're European. You live in Europe, you're part of Europe. And as a result, trying to find a way to work with all of your neighbors as part of a greater Europe, to take the kinds of decisions that allow Serbia to be part of Europe, in the end, part of the European Union, which is a critical institution in Europe, is where the future of Serbia lies. And I very much hope that the people of Serbia take that message to heart, to remind themselves every day that, yes, you are Serbian, but you're also European.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, gentlemen. It was really a fascinating and a humbling experience talking to the great sages of America and Asia. Thank you for being positive. You are, guys, one of the more positive interlocutors that I've had during these Corona dialogues. Let us hope that the administrations in the power capitals of the world will heed to your advice, and that after this crisis humbled us all and reminded us of how reliant we are, how relying we are on each other, and how the world is, after all, a very small and very interconnected place. Let us hope that this knowledge are going to bring us not to more confrontation and more rivalry, but to more cooperation in the 21st century. Thank you once again. Thank you for joining from Singapore and from Chicago. Thank you for being the guests of Belgrade. Kishore was a guest of Belgrade once physically. Ivo hasn't yet, of the CIRSD. You have an invitation to come and perhaps repeat this kind of conversation in vivo once COVID-19 is history. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Goodbye.
Good to see you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good to see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.